Recently I made videos talking about this new cancer theory, which talks about how mitochondria can be affected in cancer cells, or basically is always affected in cancer cells, which is what leads to cancer. And this is actually not a new theory. This theory has been proposed a long time ago, but it has been now reintroduced in this year by a group of scientists. And in today's video, I want to tell you more about mitochondria and press it upon you how perturbations to its proper functions can indeed shift the behavior of cells and dramatically into completely different entities, such as becoming cancerous. So my name is Dr. Mikola Rashek of Merogenomics, and let's get started on this. So this particular paper was sent to me by one of the Patreon members, so thank you for that. Very, very cool paper. Basically, it talks about how mitochondria, typically when we think of mitochondria, the analogy that is used for description of mitochondria is that it is the powerhouse of the cell. Why is that? Is because mitochondria, these tiny little organelles inside our cells, they produce ATP. And ATP is basically energy currency that is used by our cells. So these are adenine triphosphate. These are, you can think of these as tiny little batteries that can then diffuse throughout the cell, and all the elements of our cells that need energy can then use ATP to do all of their work and all of their functions. Okay, so that's where the analogy that mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell has come from. However, these authors say that's actually quite limiting, because that is a limited description of what mitochondria really does and how powerful it is in its function. Rather, they're saying you should think of mitochondria as a processor, like a computer processor that takes information, processes the information, and then gives powerful output that then affects not just the cell, but they're saying that the processing of mitochondria is one of those information outputs that affects the entire body. All right, and we're going to be talking about describing this in great detail. But before I go there and talk about this processing, let me give you a little bit more background on mitochondria. So mitochondria, these organelles, can only be inherited from your mom, so much so that you can actually track inheritance that way. It is unique in that it is interesting because it has two membranes. So it has the outer membrane, of course, like all organelles or the cell. There's an outer membrane, but mitochondria has also an inner membrane as well. So, and this inner membrane can fold a lot, and it can fold into features called cystry. Just think of it like tiny little tentacles inside mitochondria. There's lots of them. And the reason why that's of interest to us is because the reason why mitochondria does that is to increase the surface area of this membrane inside. And this membrane inside has all of the proteins or molecules that are needed by the mitochondria in order to produce this oxidative phosphorylation, which is what stops working in cancer cells. And basically, oxidative phosphorylation, what that is that's what it is needed to produce ATP. So what happens is when you take food source, which is your fuel, you can break down your food source, such as say glucose or fats, and as you break it down, all atoms have electrons around them, and you can steal an electron from an atom during the process of breaking down a fuel that we eat, and such an electron can be put inside a mitochondria, and it's shuffled around inside that inner mitochondria through what is referred to as electron transport chain. And this is part of the process of this oxidative phosphorylation. And as you move the electron through one protein inside that inner membrane of mitochondria to another, then you create a force that allows to produce those ATP. Eventually, that electron is donated to to oxygen molecule, which is why we need to breathe. And when that electron is donated to oxygen molecule, what happens at that point, that oxygen can be used to produce water. And that's the end. Sometimes this breaks down, doesn't work properly. This happens prematurely, and this is or in an inappropriate place, and you can create reactive oxygen species. These are dangerous because they are very reactive. They can destroy things in our cells. However, sometimes we can use reactive oxygen species as a weapon against pathogens. So immune cells, for example, can use that. So that's basically in a nutshell what mitochondria does. But on top of that, mitochondria is also interesting It's not the only organelle that has inner membrane as well. Nucleus does as well. Nucleus, of course, is the organelle that houses all of the DNA inside our cells. But the other very interesting feature, and this is what makes mitochondria unique, is that it has its own DNA. It has a circular DNA that's called plasmid DNA, and most of its genetic material over time has been exported out into the nucleus. So the vast majority of mitochondria function is now controlled by the nucleus, but it still has its own DNA. And that DNA itself is very, not only is it important because it codes for information that mitochondria needs, but as we will discuss, it actually can work as a sensor of information itself. All right, so then let's talk about this processing. Basically, they call this, they refer to this system as mitochondria processing mitochondria information processing system. And basically the concept here is that mitochondria can sense a lot of different information. It has tons and tons of different sensors and receptors on its surface, and it can process tons of information all at the same time. And all of that information, while it's processed, they they call it integration, or it's being integrated together. And then you have a signal output. All of that is referred to as signal transduction. Signal transduction is a common name in sciences and biology used to describe how one type of information is transcends to somewhere else inside the cell. So mitochondria does that as well. But the point here that the authors are getting at is that this goes beyond just affecting the cell. What their authors are suggesting or talking about is that when mitochondria does this, that it not only does it affect the inside of the cells, other organelles within the cells, but it also, this processing of mitochondria by one cell can affect in how surrounding cells can also act and behave, to a point that it can affect organs, and then also this in fact can affect the function of the entire body. And then some of the examples right off the top of my head that I'm going to tell you. First of all, mitochondria can be passed around from cell to cell. So it's not stuck, it doesn't have to be stuck within a single cell. So mitochondria, their function can go outside the cell. So that's one. But for example, another example is mitochondria can be used for building of neurotransmitters, and of course, neurotransmitters, your nerve cells need that. And of course, when your nerve cells functions to affect your entire body. But another last example that I'll give you off the top of my head is that mitochondria are also use cholesterol to build steroid hormones, which are very powerful hormones for the function that affect your entire body as well. This is, by the way, I also made videos on cholesterol crystals, which can also be formed inside cancer cells as well. And this is very interesting because cholesterol is deeply needed by mitochondria, and there is that regulatory aspect of how cholesterol is used by mitochondria, which can impact how much cholesterol starts to build up in a cell. And of course, the buildup of cholesterol can lead to cholesterol crystals. Check out those videos, very, very interesting stuff, because they can be very dangerous. All right, so then the best parts of this really complicated review were the figures. So let me show you the figures. The very first figure, if you look at that figure, right in the center of it, you have a cell, and in the middle of that cell, you have this dark gray ball. That's the nucleus. Nucleus, of course, houses all of the genetic material, the DNA. And you can see that it's hugged all around by mitochondria, which basically what happens in real life. Mitochondria is in very close proximity to nucleus, but it's spread out. There's also mitochondria all throughout. And then that cell is surrounded by this tube. That's basically a blood vessel that carries information from the entire body. And the input of information into this cell and therefore into the mitochondria, there's different types of inputs. So one of the inputs is systemic. That comes from the blood. Systemic means comes from the entire body. Basically, blood is the language of the body, and that means entire body can communicate to any individual cell such way. But there's other sources of inputs that mitochondria uses. One of them is cytoplasmic. So basically everything that happens inside the cell, cytoplasm is the name we use for the liquid part of inside the cell. And then there's also extrinsic input, so that's information immediately outside the cell, and then there's intrinsic input, and that's the information right from within the mitochondria itself. And the inputs themselves are extremely diverse. There's lots of information that mitochondria can assess. This is listed on the left hand side of the figure, and it includes, obviously, I already mentioned hormones, but it can include metabolites, it can include ions, gases, and nutrients. It includes ATP or ADP molecules. So remember, ATP molecules are the little energy molecules. When you use them up, it becomes ADP. And then you need to use ADP to convert back to ATP. So that mitochondria clearly senses that. And then even the actual mitochondrial DNA is a sensory input for mitochondria as well. And then all of this is being integrated and processed by mitochondria. And this is done through communication with other mitochondria, communications with other organelles, especially nucleus. And then finally you have the output, and there's two types of outputs. They refer to as direct, which is the output that mitochondria directly puts out into the, say, blood system, and therefore affects the entire body, and as well as indirect, which is basically when that's the influence mitochondria has on the nucleus, and the nucleus will have its outcomes, genetic outcomes, and start affecting the body as well. So these are the two outputs. There's also a very big list of outputs listed on that figure, but we're going to, which is very similar to inputs, but we're going to now jump to another figure of the paper to discuss outputs. But basically the outputs themselves, they outputs themselves can affect morphology of the mitochondria. So basically the mitochondria can shapeshift, and so it can change from one entity to another. It also can affect function of the cell. So what function of the mitochondria. So what will mitochondria actually do? And that, all of that together affects the biochemistry or biochemical output of the mitochondria. So everything that mitochondria will release into the environment, which starts affecting the message, which affects not just the cell, but eventually, if you send that information to the bloodstream, it can affect the entire body. So let's talk about the figure that showed some of the outputs. They subdivided into 10 categories. Let's see if I can remember it in the appropriate order. I'm going to start with the top of the figure, where they talk about energetics. And basically, energetics refers to that production of ATP versus ADP. And basically, for example, if there's too much ADP inside around mitochondria will sense it really quick, and will dramatically and rapidly start changing its morphology. So, for example, I mentioned that cis trees, those folds inside the mitochondria, those were rapidly increase in size and condense, so that such a mitochondria that notice that there's too much ADP around, they will rapidly increase oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation produces lots of ATP. So that's one very cool example. There's also NADH and NADPH molecules. Those are the molecules that can capture electrons when we break down the fuel source that we eat, like such as glucose and fats. Remember, I was telling you that they are broken down and electrons can be put inside mitochondria, which is what you need to produce ATP. Those are the molecules that capture it and bring it to the mitochondria to the right place. So that's obviously being sensed as well. So this is what is meant by energetics. Next in line are the metabolites. Now, metabolites is very interesting. Basically, metabolites are chemical byproducts of chemical reactions taking place inside mitochondria, okay? But what's very cool about metabolites is that mitochondrial metabolites influence epigenetics of the nucleus. So what is epigenetics? Epigenetics, that basically is a chemical alterations that can happen inside the nucleus that will determine how genetic information is used. So there's a couple of things that can happen. Number one, you can chemically alter specific molecules inside the nucleus that wind up DNA. So that means when they wind it up, they're called histones, by the way, DNA is no longer available for use, or you can unwind them and then DNA is available to be used. So metabolites from mitochondria can affect that process. So that's number one. And number two is DNA methylation. You can methylate or chemically alter DNA on its surface. So like DNA has a specific structure, and you can add chemicals on top of it, which will determine whether that DNA is now used or not. That's DNA methylation. Both of these processes is called epigenetics. And again, mitochondrial metabolites can rapidly influence that process. So much so that, remember, I made one video in the past talking about biological aging. You can actually measure your own biological aging based on how much your DNA is methylated, and your biological aging should be similar to your chronological aging, but it does not have to be. And so this shows you how mitochondria can influence that, so much so throughout your life that you can literally measure your biological aging process that way. So that's very interesting. I thought that was super cool how these metabolites from mitochondria have profound impact. The reason why, because epigenetics is something that is very transient, and your life experiences can rapidly affect how your DNA is being used at any given moment in time. Now, the only thing that and one more thing I'll mention about metabolites is I'll mention one special metabolite that mitochondria creates, and that's melatonin. And I made 2 videos on melatonin and its powerful functions. But this is a perfect example, once again, how mitochondria can affect entire body, because melatonin influences your circadian rhythm of the entire body. All right, so then moving forward, next is ions and metals that mitochondria can output as well. Sense and output. For example, if mitochondria senses too much calcium in its vicinity, if it's too egregious, it can literally create signals for the cell to commit suicide, and that will be done via mitochondria. After that, we're going to be talking about physical interactions, which is basically physical interactions of mitochondria with other mitochondria, as well as other organelles. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Nucleus is a perfect example. Mitochondria is very, very close to nucleus. They're basically touching each other, so much so that when mitochondria performs its functions, it will send in signals to the nucleus very rapidly. It can reach signal from mitochondria to the nucleus in milliseconds. So that's super fast. So mitochondria is not fooling around there, right? After that, we have heat. Mitochondria produces heat. Actually, I bet you I didn't know this. And of course, heat in itself increases chemical reactions, speed of chemical reactions. So heat itself is like a sensor, and it can create like a gradient of impact around. But on top of that, the temperature of mitochondria, inside mitochondria, where it's producing all of that energy, can reach 50 degrees Celsius, which is crazy. So also mitochondria are very important for producing heat for our cells and basically our body. After that, we have gases and reactive oxygen species. So reactive oxygen species, I already mentioned that these can be very dangerous, but it can be used by our body as a weapon against pathogens. Moving forward, we have genetic information. So this is mitochondria can not only just influence the genetic information of the nucleus, that's one, but it can also affect via its own DNA what is produced. So, and that DNA I mentioned, mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, can act as a sensor. And what do I mean by that? Well, it can sense toxins that start mutating its DNA, but it can also sense the lack of chemicals you need for copying mitochondrial DNA, because mitochondrial DNA, it's a small circular plasmid. You can make many copies of it, and that can change. How many copies of that DNA you have can change from moment to moment, and this can all be sensed. And therefore, once it's sensed, it determines how much RNA is produced by mitochondria. Remember, DNA is used as a template to produce RNA or mRNA, which is then used as a template to produce proteins, which are the molecular robots that do different functions in our cells. So all of this can affect how much RNA or proteins or peptides, which are basically fragments of proteins, mitochondria can produce, and that in itself will affect function of mitochondria. Always one of the major functions is that oxidative phosphorylation, which is what is broken inside cancerous cells. You don't have that, right? Which is why cancer cells are now dependent on other fuel sources than what would be typically expected from a healthy cell. All right, so there's that. So and as I mentioned, on top of that, also mitochondria can release its DNA into the circulation, and that in itself has certain function. And for example, it's known that if you have too much of mitochondrial DNA circulating free, so cell-free mitochondrial DNA, if you have a lot of it, that is seen in diseases and is a predictor of mortality. All right, so let's move forward. After that, we got vesicles. Now, vesicles are basically fragments that can come out from cells. Mitochondria can also have vesicles, and it can send out its own packages of information, and sometimes even entire mitochondria can be sent out in vesicles to other parts of the body as well. So that's another very interesting output right there. And then second to last is peptides, and mitochondria can produce small peptide fragments, which are just basically like, imagine fragments of proteins, and proteins are like the molecular robots. Basically, these peptides are involved in longevity, and you increase those via exercise. One more thing that I'll mention is that some proteins can also be released by mitochondria. Cytochrome C is one of those proteins. If that enters cytoplasm, so goes out from mitochondria into the rest of the cell, that can be sensed by other molecules inside the cell, and that can then be taken to the nucleus, and it will start destroying the genome of the nucleus. Okay, so and basically that signal will lead the cell to commit suicide, basically, and that's called apoptosis, so programmed cell death. And the last one is steroids, basically steroid hormones. And steroid hormones, when those are released, they basically signal the body that something very energetically expensive will be taking place. And you can see that if mitochondria is involved in production of these steroids, it can actually sense what is the capacity of a given cell of the body itself. What is the energetic capacity of the body, and then it can determine how many steroids it should be producing. All right, I think I'm gonna wrap up this part of the video first. The ending comes from a different direction, but that's okay. You might as well see the beautiful location. And we're going to basically continue this video in a second installment, where I'll talk about the integration of information that mitochondria does, and then summarize the video. So I'll see you in a second installment, and enjoy the view one more time, and bye for now, everyone. Here's the same mountain as before. Ciao.